Good to have you all back with us. We have an exciting one today with Professor J.P. Moreland out at Biola University. He has been ranked as one of the top 50 most influential philosophers today. So a real treat, going to get deep, not stay too light. And he is big on apologetics. I think it's fair to say that he is certainly one of the most influential apologists as well. He's helped my thinking, Cliff's thinking, certainly over the years in debates as well as pastoral work too. So JP, thanks so much for coming on.
Well, Stuart, it's my privilege, believe me.
We have a couple books that we're going to put in the links below afterwards. And one of his newer ones, Scientism and Secularism. Absolutely loved this book. I think, right up there at the top in smaller letters, learning to respond to a dangerous ideology. We'll flesh that one out a little bit more. And then also The Soul, Cliff and I, if some of you tuned in to one of our more recent debates, Aaron Ra and another guy, we debated on The Soul, and they took it from a strictly materialistic perspective. So JP will, I'm sure, be able to speak to that one. And then also his third book that I'd love to speak briefly on is Finding Quiet, which is a lot on his personal story and some on anxiety. So I'll let him speak more so to that one. So JP, would you mind opening us with just helping us think through perhaps mental health, the Christian faith, and your personal journey in those areas?
Yeah, you bet. My personal journey, I was born with a genetic predisposition towards general anxiety disorder. That doesn't mean I had to do it, but I was predisposed to it, made it easier for me to become anxious. I was raised in an extremely anxious family. My mom was very anxious. And so I was inclined to that most of my life until 2003. And I had a 7-month nervous breakdown where I just fell apart. I had to cancel my classes, and it was horrible. And I got on medication. I got into some good Christian therapy and began to do some spiritual things, and I got better for 10 years, but then it happened again in 2013 and for 5 months. And at that point, I purposed in my heart to use my research skills and to learn everything I could about this and to boil some things down into a set of practices that I wanted to add to medication and therapy. And it has been a tremendously life-changing experience. I've never been doing better, and it's been so. I put it in a book called Finding Quiet as an attempt to simply share some of the things that have helped me in my own journey.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So when you hear a Christian say, "Oh no, you don't have to turn to things like medication or therapy," actually, those kinds of things are certainly not Christian. And perhaps even a mental health issue could be a sin issue, and all you have to do is pray it out. How do you respond to those kind of issues?
Well, there is a tendency for people to reduce our problems down to one aspect of our lives, and this is a spiritual problem. The difficulty with that is that there are explicit biblical texts in the Old Testament that recommend the use of alcohol for medicinal purposes for mental illness. And so that people who were depressed and downtrodden were advised to take wine and strong drink and to cheer their hearts. So this is not advocating drunkenness, but I don't think there's anything wrong with drinking anyway. But the point is that we have texts in the Old Testament that clearly set a precedent for this. Secondly, that kind of an attitude, Stuart, really flies in the face of biblical anthropology. We are body, soul, spirit, emotion, and all of the above. And so when something's wrong with me, it may start in an area. It may start in my brain chemistry. It may start in certain spiritual practices and activities that are just counterproductive, or it may start with psychological problems. I don't care where it starts, but it can easily bleed over into the other areas because we're holistic. We have different components, but they function together as a unity. Why in the world would I be stupid enough, if I'm suffering anxiety and depression, to attack it with only one aspect and have my other hand tied behind my back? I may be dumb, but I'm not stupid. Should I pray? Oh, you bet. And I explain how to do that in the book, because the typical prayer doesn't work. But why not take vitamins for my brain, which is what medication is, because it restores your brain chemistry where your brain is not functioning properly. And why not deal with maybe some traumas in my childhood or other things? So I just think it's absolutely ridiculous if there are these three different facets that are available to me: spirituality, good psychological counseling that doesn't contradict scripture, and medication, exercise, other things that I would do for my body. Why not do them all? I don't get it.
Yep. That makes total sense. Awesome. Thank you for fleshing that out. So guys, definitely JP's book, Finding Quiet, check it out. Such a nuanced approach. That's why it's honestly my favorite. I've read a ton of books on mental health because I got a master's in it, had to, the integration of spirituality as well as psychology. And honestly, JP, I'm not exaggerating at all. I think your book in its holistic approach can just help so many, especially Christians, thinking deeper through this issue, and especially during quarantine now. Unfortunately, I've seen people dying from the opioid epidemic because they've isolated. And so frequently those are comorbid with anxiety disorders. And people are just so isolated again right now, whatever the issue. And so your book, I think now more so than ever, really can speak to these issues and help people truly get better.
Well, that's my hope. Yeah, go ahead.
Exactly. So let's just shift gears here now to scientism. What is scientism? Why is it a dangerous ideology? And how in the world do we think through confronting that type of ideology today?
Well, those are great questions, I must say. And let me begin in a slightly different order. Let's think about knowledge. Let's not worry about what it is, but we all recognize when we know something and when we don't. Knowledge is what gives people the authority to define reality and to speak and act in public, in the public square. And it gives people courage. So, for example, a dentist can go anywhere and lecture on a certain aspect of reality that is teeth and the way they function and how they break down and the gums. And that person is given authority to define that aspect of reality and speak on it authoritatively. And he has boldness to do so. Now, why? It's not because we think he's got very, very sincere beliefs about molars. It's not because we think that he is enthusiastic about molars and deeply committed to teeth. Those are all nice, but quite frankly, what I want to know is this guy or gal know what he's talking about? And if he has knowledge, then he has authority. Now, if you are able to depict Christianity as a set of beliefs or a worldview for which, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, but nobody has a clue. You can't know any of this. You can't know if there's life after death. Then you're going to weaken people's confidence to share their faith, and this Christian community is going to cower into being withdrawn, and nobody will listen to us. And so it's important that we reestablish the idea that the central claims of Christianity are things people can actually know to be true. That doesn't mean being certain, because you can know things about which you're not 100% certain. It just means that you have a true belief about it that's based on very adequate reasons and grounds. Even though you might be wrong, you don't have any good reason to think you're wrong. You actually know the thing in question, though you may have doubts and questions still, but you've got adequate grounds for it. All right. the number one thing that's undermining our ability to make that case in ethics and in theology is scientism. And there are two versions of it, but basically, scientism is the idea that the only way to know what's real, or at least the vastly superior way of knowing what's real, is through the hard sciences. So we can know that electrons exist because we can test that in chemistry and physics and so on. But I can't know that kindness is a virtue, or that we ought to care for the poor, because those are not testable in the hard sciences. This is why all the soft sciences have physics envy, and they're all trying to quantify things to make their disciplines look like they're the hard sciences so they can gain respect in the culture and the academy. Now, I'm not against quantification, but I mean, come on, this is being overdone. So what Christians have got to watch out for is not the legitimate claims of science. We weigh those on a case-by-case basis. I don't believe them just because scientists tell me they're true, but I assess them. What we really have to worry about is the philosophy of science called scientism. And you've witnessed to somebody, I'm sure, and you've had the response, hey, look, man, you can't prove that scientifically, so I don't have any reason to believe it. And the assumption is that the only way that you can know something is if you can test it scientifically. Otherwise, it may be true, but nobody can know one way or the other. So you're legislating religion or morality because you're imposing your views on other people without being able to argue for them.
That's helpful. Now, why, when it comes to the soul, why do atheists so frequently kind of put it to us that, oh no, there's a consensus now with materialism in understanding that there's not such thing as a soul? And one that I really heard that was interesting that an atheist really was trying to drive home in debating us was this difference between a soul and a self. He was saying there's absolutely a self, but there's not a soul. How do you debate different atheists?
Well, the reason that they're almost all committed to some kind of material physicalism, everything's physical, or at least depends on the physical, is because if you start your worldview in the beginning with the particles, and you have a big bang, and you've got whatever's down there at the bottom level, turtles or strings or wavicles, just call them particles. And if the history of the world is the rearrangement of particles according to the laws of physics and chemistry into more complicated arrangements of particles, guess what you're going to end up with? Various arrangements of particles. Mm-hmm. You're not going to get consciousness squirting into existence, because to do so is to get something from nothing. Now, a lot of people try to say, well, consciousness is an emergent property, which means that when matter reaches the right level of complexity, consciousness appears and it's not physical. The problem is emergence is just a name for the problem. It's not a solution. That's slapping a name on what the problem is. Namely, the problem is, how can you get non-physical consciousness when you start with pure physical materials that don't contain any consciousness in them at all, not even the potential for it, and all you do is rearrange them. So that's why they're there. Now, why they're committed to materialism, because they have no explanation for its origin, not even an evolutionary one. And theists do, because we say in the beginning was the logos, that is mind. And so if there are subsequent minds, we have no difficulty in counting for that. But they can't, because they begin with mindless particles, brute matter. All right. Now, if somebody says to me, for example, there's a consensus on this, well, I'd like to know where they got that idea. If they could cite some statistics. I do think that there are a lot of materialists. I don't count neuroscientists because they're just ignorant. They don't have any clue about what's going on. I lectured at the National Institute of Health a few years ago. I was invited to speak there by someone I did not know. I spoke to about 130 research biologists and neuroscientists, and I made two claims. First of all, when it comes to the ontological question of what is consciousness and what is the self or the soul, we'll get to that in a minute, neuroscience is utterly irrelevant. It has nothing to say. It has a lot to say about dependency relations between consciousness and brain states and causal relations, but that's it. Secondly, when you look at the philosophical arguments, it becomes clear that consciousness and soul aren't physical. I got absolutely no pushback because these people, men and women, did not even know the questions because they're trained in certain research techniques, but they don't know how to deal with ontological questions. It's not in their field of study. So what neuroscientists think about this is irrelevant to me. Plus, they already presuppose consciousness isn't physical. Because when they're doing research on a patient and they want to know what's going to correlate their conscious states with brain states, they have to ask the patient what's going on in their minds. Why do they have to ask if the state is physical? Why don't they just measure it with some kind of a brainwave instrument? The reason they have to ask is because consciousness is something people have private access to. They're aware of their conscious states directly and immediately, and guess what? Nobody else can be aware of my mental states. I have to communicate them verbally or through body language. And why is that? That's because consciousness is not publicly accessible. It's immaterial. All material things are publicly accessible, meaning we can all have equal access to them, including brain states. All right. Now, the self and the soul, the self is the soul as far as I'm concerned. Now, anybody has a right to define things any way they want to. So if somebody wants to define self and say that it's not the soul, okay, fair enough. But now you owe me an account of what the two are, and what, even if you don't believe in souls, surely you would have an idea of what one would be. I don't know how you can say you don't believe in something you have no concept of. So what is a soul? What would a soul be if there were such? What is a self, and how do they differ? And I would push back because I don't think there's any. I'd like to know what the heck a self is. And what was there any clarity by this person on this, Cliff? Did they say what?
No, not really. Not much at all. You know, they went down the route when you were talking there about no one can really touch on my own consciousness or personal experience. When I brought up memories, even, they said, oh, no, there's new studies that have shown, and actually experimentation, that we can access people's memories now, that we've been able to see through different scans that, you know, once we crack open a monkey's head, that we can actually jot down what they've truly experienced and what they remember from even years ago. And I said, what in the world? I would love to see those studies. Have you heard of such a thing?
Well, two things. Number one, the leading expert on memory, probably in the world, probably published more on this than anybody, who's a psychology professor at UC Santa Barbara, not a believer, came to Biola to lecture a few years ago, and he let out with a statement, I have absolutely no idea what it means to say that memories are in the brain. I don't even know what that means. He said it's incoherent. Memories aren't, and I'll tell you, the reason is memories are not spatially extended. My memory of my grandmother cooking fried chicken with her paisley dress on, what the memory's about was spatially extended, namely my grandmother, but my memory of it has no width. There doesn't make any sense to say how many inches wide is your memory of your grandmother. Everything in the brain has spatial extension that's physical, because I think physically extended objects have at least some minimal amount of spatial extension. So everything physical in the brain is extended. Memories aren't extended, therefore memories aren't in the brain. And I'll say one other thing in a minute, but just think of it like this. Is there sound in a CD? No, the answer is there is no sound in it. If you were going to analyze what it's made up of, it would be grooves and and different kinds of magnetic structures and so on. What happens is if the CD is in good shape and you've got the right retrieval system, you put the CD in there and it will produce sound in the room. Well, similarly, what the brain has are grooves. These are neural networks that have fired together repeatedly. And those grooves are purely describable in the language of the hard sciences. They aren't memories any more than the magnetized grooves of a CD or noise. But if you take the right retrieval system, namely me, and I begin to search, and my brain isn't broken through Alzheimer's, then the searching will trigger that groove and it will spark a memory in my soul or mind. So memories aren't in the brain. Now, the other thing is this. That they were able to do this with a monkey. How would they do it? Well, first of all, they'd have to come up with a table or a chart. And on one column, there would have to be myriads of brain states that have been measured. And on the other, myriads of mental states that they believe the monkey is in. And one of the reasons they might believe that is because they're holding an object right in front of the monkey while they're registering the brain. They assume rightly that the monkey's staring at the object. You understand? So what you'd end up with is brain state 1, red round object, brain state 2, red square object, and so on. So you'd end up with a table. And so if you went into the monkey's brain and you saw grooves that fit your table, you could assume that the monkey had had experiences of that type of object. But to get the table set up in the first place, you have to assume that the experience of the object that you're correlating with the brain state is something you don't have access to. If it's a human and you were coming up, you'd have to wake them up and say, when they're having rapid eye movement, what's going on? And they would report, I'm having a dream of free falling off of a mountain. Okay, then they'd correlate that. The next time they saw that brain state, they would assume that that's likely what's going on. And if they woke you up, you'd report it. But you can't do that with a monkey, but you can make a reasonable assumption it's probably experiencing what's right in front of its eyes, right? So even if they were able to do that, the correlation list on which they base their inference itself can only be generated if you assume a dualist view of consciousness as something privately accessible to the monkey or to a human being.
That's good. Thank you.
All right, JP, how do you respond to someone who says, look, JP, the soul is the result, the self is the result of incredibly complex chemical reactions that we cannot understand, but we're growing in our understanding of it, and someday we will understand the physical makeup of the soul, what you call, Cliff, or JP, or Stuart, the soul or the self. How do you respond to that basic idea that the self, the soul, is just an incredibly complex chemical reaction?
Oh, gosh. Number one, I'd say prove it. Where's your evidence for that? And the evidence they would give me would simply be more increasingly precise correlations. So Aquinas knew that if you got drunk or hit in the head, you wouldn't be able to think very well. Okay? Well, now we're able to pinpoint the precise region of the brain that has to be damaged before you can think certain thoughts. So what we've accomplished in 500 or 800 years is absolutely nothing, except we've made things more precise. Now, why would a believer in the soul have to believe that when something happens to my brain and it affects my mental functioning, it has to happen to my brain as a whole thing? Why couldn't it happen to a specific region of my brain that would cause me to, let's say, have a memory of something? So in surgery, they've been able to put an electrode in a specific area of a person's brain, and it triggers a memory of a specific kind. Okay, what we've learned to do then, Stuart, is to take general correlations and under what are called localization studies, make them more precise with respect to specific brain states and specific locations and their causal correlation with a specific kind of mental state. That's all. Or that we've made more precise dependency relations. But that has absolutely nothing to do with the question, what is a soul and why believe in it? So these correlations, everybody grants them. They're irrelevant. All they show is that the soul and the brain are dependent on one another when you're embodied. So that's number one. Number two, the incredible evidence of near-death experiences, that especially evidential near-death experiences, where people who die and gain information that they report to doctors and nurses, and it's in their medical record, and there's no way they could have known that information if it were simply oxygen deprivation of the brain or something like that, because the information they know happened 2 doors down in another room, and the eyewitnesses reported that was exactly what happened. There are hundreds of cases like this, and there are 14 million Americans who've had near-death experiences. Now, in those cases, it shows that you can have a full range of mental states without a brain or body at all. And so that would be a second thing that I would argue. And then there's so many others. One of them very quickly is that in order to have reasoning, in order to be rational, you have to be able to deliberate. That means to weigh evidence and then draw a conclusion. But to deliberate, that presupposes that the process of deliberation, the end result hasn't been determined ahead of time. That it's still up to you as to what you end up accepting. Right. But that presupposes freedom of the will, so that rational deliberation doesn't make any sense if what you're going to conclude is determined by something that happened before you started deliberating.
Right.
You have to presuppose that you're free to weigh evidence and this, that, and the other.
Right.
Now, if I'm my brain and all my brain is a collection of complex chemicals, I'm sorry, but there's not going to be any free will, because conglomerations of atoms and molecules, I don't care what structure they're in, do not behave freely. They either behave random and deterministically or strictly deterministically, but free will is neither of those. Right. And I could say other things, but those
No, that's good. That's helpful. All right, shifting gears just quickly. There are more and more people that are insisting that morality can be objective in spite of the fact that there is no God. And an article that I just read recently was positing that experience is the basis of objective morality. Now, this author was bending over backwards to say, now, when I say objective, I do not mean objective in a scientific sense, but I mean more like you were saying earlier, JP, that we can know this to be true, that morality is objective. How would you respond to that?
Well, first of all, it's a category fallacy. Category fallacy is claiming, ascribing the wrong kind of attributes to the wrong kind of thing, like how many inches long is the note C? Well, notes don't fit in the category of having spatial extension. Now, the reason this is a category fallacy is it's a confusion between a way of knowing and the thing that's known. That would be like saying that physical objects in the world are based on my senses. Now, maybe my knowledge of them is based on my senses.
Right.
Talking about there being objects in the first place. In other words, with the moral issue, their claim is that there is objective morality. And we don't need God because we can base that on experience. Well, wait a minute. Experience isn't going to tell you how there could be such a thing as objective morality if God doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. For that, you need to give me an ontological account of where these values could come from. Mm-hmm. All you've done is given me a way that you know them, but you haven't given an account of how they could be. So the statement is terribly confused. It is confusing a way that I know objective morality with the real question. How could there be such a thing in given my ontology? If I'm a theist, I've got no problem. If I'm not, the only thing I can do is punt to emergentism. And there's a book that just came out with William Lane Craig debating Eric Wielenberg on this, God and morality. And I've got a chapter in there where I take apart Wielenberg's attempt to say there's objective morality because it emerges from matter. When matter reaches a level of consciousness, it's right. Emergent property. And I show 6 or 7 things wrong with that. I can't go into it.
Right.
Now, may I give you one other point on this?
Please.
This is going to be very important for you, okay? Thomas Nagel wrote a book called The Last Word. And Nagel is one of the leading philosophers in the world. He has been for decades. He's an atheist at New York University, but he's a fair-minded person. Nagel says that if there is no God, and we grant that the only way we could have come about is through evolution, even if there is objective morality, there's no way anybody could know what it is. And here's why. He says, I'm going to give you my own way of putting this. Suppose that you went into a widget factory, and that's a factory where widgets come off this assembly line. Who cares what a widget is? And the first 10 widgets that come out appear red to you. And so you tell somebody the first 10 widgets are red. And I think everybody would agree that you're most likely right about that. After all, the widgets are right in front of you. You see them, and there's no reason to think that they're not red. But now suppose we tell a slightly different story. Suppose that before you went into this widget factory, you were told truthfully that the lighting up on the ceiling and the glasses that you were wearing combine to make everything look red.
Right.
Okay, so now the widgets come off and you report that the first 10 widgets are red. You still could be right. Maybe they are red, but now you don't have any reason to believe they're red because they appear that way to you. Because given the lighting and the glasses you have on, you no longer have what is called counterfactual sensitivity. You lack counterfactual sensitivity. Now, what is that? Counterfactual sensitivity means that if you believe one thing, but if the facts were different, you would not change your belief. So counterfactual sensitivity means that if you believe a barn is in a field and you are told honestly that it's actually not a barn, it's a paper mache straight board that looks like a barn, then you would no longer believe it because you would be sensitive to something contrary to the fact that there are barns in the field. You see, if you are going to continue to believe your belief, whether the facts are there or not, then the facts don't matter to you. All right. Now, Nagel says that the reason we have the moral beliefs we do is solely because of their reproductive advantage. They have nothing to do with whether or not they're true. So we end up having this belief that racism is wrong and rape is wrong and so on. That's not because they're true in some sort of Platonic heaven without God. It's rather because having those beliefs aided us in the struggle for survival. So what that means is, says Nagel, and I'll close with this, he said, let's assume that there are objective moral laws out there, and one of them is that rape is wrong. Let's suppose that's true. Now, here I am as a human being in a godless universe. I've evolved, and I believe that rape is wrong. Well, it just so happens, as a matter of luck, that my belief is true, because it corresponds to this objective Platonic form that rape is wrong. But now, suppose that counterfactually, that is contrary to the fact that there really is such a thing as that duty, that there was no Platonic realm and there were no objective moral duties. Now we live in a valueless world. I would still believe that rape is wrong, whether or not there was a moral law that said that, because my belief that rape is wrong has nothing to do with whether it truly matches reality. It has everything to do with whether that belief helps me have survival value and reproductive advantage. So Nagel said, if you're an atheist and an evolutionist, and you start postulating objective emergent values of some kind, it doesn't do any good because you still couldn't know them. This person who says, well, I know them by experience, he's assuming that the processes that developed his sensory and intuitive faculties were processes that developed faculties sensitive to truth and to facts. But if he actually believed the creation story of evolution, he ought to know that all of his faculties are the way they are, not because they gather truth from the world, but because they help me survive. Right. And so, given this atheist now has a defeater for trusting his experience as a guide to objective morality that comes from his creation story, just like the factory person who's told about the lighting in his glasses now has a defeater that undermines his confidence that the widgets are the way they look to him. And so that just is a non-starter.
Thank you so much. So Thomas Nagel is your guy.
Last word.
Yeah, last word.
Mine and Cosmos, too. Has helped a lot of people.
Oh, dude, that's a good book.
Hey, just in closing, because we're finishing up here, give us your 1 minute based off of kind of the moral argument as well as how people use subjectivism and my experience. Why do you choose Christian ethics over secular ethics? We're about to have a debate on this topic. How do you think through that? Where would you go just to start?
If you're going to advance a secular ethic, my first question would be, where do your ethics come from? And how do you know they're true? So I would ask somebody to give me their basis for ethics in a secular view of the world. Where the society agreement, hopefully not Nazi society, your faculties or whatever. Well, that's confusing, knowing with being. And you also have the problem of a lack of counterfactual sensitivity. And I would say that a Christian ethic is based upon a worldview of the world in which objective morality makes a lot of sense. But not only that, in a Christian view of the world, we have belief in an objective natural moral law, and we have belief in a revealed scripture and evidence for that, by the way. We don't just hold it by blind faith. And the natural moral law, which the state ought to be under, we don't want to put the state under the Bible. We want to put it under the natural law. And then we have scripture that Christians can come to understand what's right and wrong in certain ways, and then try to find independent arguments for it that don't presuppose the Bible. Objective morality makes sense in our world, but I don't know how it could make sense in a secular worldview. And I'd ask them to try to explain to me where your sexual ethic comes from, or whatever it might be.
That's great. And so humanism, there's a lot of humanists out there right now. Most of the atheists we talk to are humanists, secular humanists. And basically they're just removing God and replacing God with the good. And humanism obviously stole from Christianity. Nietzsche was right in that. And there's a lot of people like Christian Smith at Notre Dame, for example, who are saying, okay, just wait and watch the repercussions now, though, because those ethics won't last once you remove God. You'd agree with that?
Oh, dude. Christian Smith is on the money. Christian Smith is on the money. I've seen his book, and absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Yep. Great. Well, thank you so much.
My
JP,
privilege.
this is so good. One of the best ones for sure. Check out his books, guys. We'll put it in the link.
Thank
And
you, JP.
subscribe to the channel. Hit that bell button too, as we have more conversations and debates coming up. JP, thanks again.
I'm proud of you guys. It's good to team up with you.
So appreciate it.
Thanks for your help, JP.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.